History as it happens, February 22nd, 2022. The rabbis who prayed before Congress.
Almighty God, Master of the universe, the members of this august body, the United States Senate.
Almighty God, 20 years ago today, an era ended, pre-9/11 world.
Stand before you in prayer and in memory, as I am reminded of Solomon, king of ancient Israel, who would preside over a most unusual judicial hearing.
Did you know that since 1860, more than 400 rabbis have appeared before the House or Senate to pray? Congress begins every day with a prayer. Sometimes it needs a guest chaplain, and sometimes that guest chaplain is a rabbi. So let's talk to the author who discovered this overlooked slice of the American past next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
On occasion, they have weighed in and talked about issues happening that day. Now, it's not the role for them to lobby for legislation, and they're not voting, but sometimes there are issues that are so overwhelming. War, for instance, immigration, COVID has been the subject of prayer. So there is like current events steeped into the prayers that are given.
A lot of the stuff we talk about here is, how shall we say, familiar ground. The American Revolution, the Cold War. You've probably read a few books about such big, important topics. But recently, I learned of a book I knew nothing about. So I figured, let's have a conversation about it. The book is titled When Rabbis Bless Congress, the Great American Story of Jewish Prayers on Capitol Hill. It was written by Howard Mortman, a self-described Congress junkie, and the communications director at C-SPAN. So it's part of his job to watch C-SPAN all day. So every day he sees the opening prayers given by the full-time chaplains when the House and Senate are in session. He unearthed some amazing stories of the lives and times of forgotten figures who witnessed some of the most important events in American history, who prayed at the very center of American democracy. Howard Mortman, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
You are the first in-studio guest on History as It Happens in the first, whatever it is now, 13 months I've been doing this podcast. So
it's great to break open the bottle of champagne over the microphone for this one. So thank you.
Well, you know, with COVID and also many of my guests are just far away. They wouldn't be able to make it in anyway. But it's great to have you here in the flesh as a fan of the podcast. That's not why you're here. We're here to discuss your book, When Rabbis Bless Congress, starting in 1860. We're going to get to this very interesting history. But first, what inspired you to write this book? What brought you to this project?
So, two things. The easy answer is I've always wanted to write a book. But then the question becomes on what and what's new and different. The book is very much a product of my working at C-SPAN. So for a living, as the communications director, basically the PR guy for C-SPAN, I watch C-SPAN and Congress all day long.
Meaning you are as informed as any human being in the country, right?
Well, without informed as anybody, I don't know who is the most informed, but it's my job to know who's saying what congressman's talking, what the topic is. The first thing that Congress does every day, they gavel in, they come into session, and the first thing they do is pray. And I've been watching this, and I've been at C-SPAN, this is my 13th year now, and I've been there. And just as an intellectual exercise, I always was curious about the first thing they do, and that's pray, because it looks like nothing else that happens throughout the day. There's no fighting, there's no voting, there's no debate. It's just a man or a woman of the cloth praying to the Almighty in the middle of the literal center of democracy. As somebody who's just interested in quirks, that's kind of quirky. Why is there a prayer that opens every session of Congress?
It goes back to the very beginning of the Republic, right?
It goes back to the very beginning. It goes back even to the Continental Congress, when the first things both the Continental Congress and the eventual Congress we have now did was to hire a chaplain, an official chaplain. And the first thing they did was pray. This goes back even before the Bill of Rights. So the history of prayer in Congress goes back to the very beginning.
And you are specifically interested in the Jewish tradition.
So every so often, when the official chaplain, and we were talking about there's an official chaplain for the House and an official chaplain for the Senate. Both are taxpayer-paid positions. Both have staff, government-paid staff. And they give the prayer that opens every session. On occasion, the official chaplain is not there. The official chaplain there is a guest chaplain. It could be because the official chaplain is elsewhere. It could be, we'll get into this, to show the diversity of religion in America. So it could be a big picture purpose, or it could be very just logistical reason. There's a guest chaplain. On occasion that happens. On occasion of the occasion, a much smaller number of times, that guest chaplain is a rabbi. And that's where my story comes in. Every so often, being Jewish and working at C-SPAN, I was curious when a rabbi would get up and do the prayer in Congress.
All your worlds converged, right?
All of the worlds converged, perfect, yeah. And then,
because you're religious, you're devout, or
actually, I'm not.
Really?
I'm not observant at all. I flunked out of religious school, which is tough to do.
No, don't play this podcast for your relatives.
Exactly,
they won't want to hear
right?
that.
Exactly. I'm not, but I will tell you though. As a result of the book, I've become more aware of of the Jewish history, scripture, teachings, and so on as a result of prayers being given in Congress. So it's been a kind of a personal journey for me, but that's not the purpose of this.
You uncovered this really interesting and probably overlooked aspect of the prayer, the daily prayer. As you said, it opens every day of Congress when Congress is in session. One of the only times maybe there's no politics involved, but maybe not. I mean, at times these prayers have overlapped a bit into politics.
They have, and two things
not
on that.
Not supposed to, but yeah.
They're not, right. They're not supposed to. They have. On occasion, they have weighed in and talked about issues happening that day. Now, it's not the role for them to lobby for legislation, and they're not voting, but sometimes there are issues that are so overwhelming. War, for instance, immigration, COVID has been the subject of prayer. So there is current events steeped into the prayers that are given. It's very important to note that even though this is a book about the rabbis who have prayed, this is really meant for congressional junkies, for people who love history.
That's right. You are a congressional junkie, even though Congress, in public opinion polls, right, Congress's approval ratings are so dismally low. You're really interested in the institution of Congress, not the partisan back and forth. Right?
Yeah, exactly right. I'm interested in the partisanship in the extent that I'm interested in who's sponsoring the guest chaplains, which party, and I can break all that down. But no, as far as, and this is partially my C-SPAN hat on, that we don't have opinions. We don't, so I have an opinionectomy, so I'm not, I would not weigh in.
Well, what's great about watching C-SPAN, and I rely on C-SPAN's online library to a great extent, when you simply watch what's happening without the lens or the filter of the cable, whatever cable network you watch, a lot gets done every day in Congress. For all the talk of dysfunction, all of the business, the normal business of the day, there's a lot going on there.
Yeah, this book, and I'm going to get to your broader points in a second, but this book is an outgrowth of all these tools that are available now, of online video, of the congressional record being digitized and searchable, the kind of tools you wouldn't have had 10 or 15 years available for free to produce this kind of book. We exist so that you can watch yourself, your politician, what your elected representative is doing, and think for yourself and form your own opinion. We're not afraid to show long hearings, budget hearings. We are a country that's over $20 trillion in debt. People want to see their politicians spend their money. How are they doing that? And without, as you say, without the narrative being thrust at you and what to think, but just give you the chance to sit back, watch for yourself, and make your own adult decision of what you think they're doing or not doing in that case.
Why does Congress have any chaplains at all? Because, I'm an atheist, a militant defender of our wall of separation. You avoid that debate in that subject. I mean, that's for other books to take on, right? But why does Congress have any chaplains at all when we have this separation?
That's a perfect question. And in fact, I have to preface by saying, you're right, I don't get into whether we should have it, but your question is, why do we have it? Why do we have it? It's simple, because the Founding Fathers wanted there to be a chaplain in Congress. And that's an important point, because every time that this has been challenged, and it has been challenged multiple times in the courts, the Supreme Court has always ruled on the side of prayer in public places.
It used to happen in public schools, of course, too. But
absolutely, public schools. And it goes back to, this is the way the founders wanted it. They wanted prayer being part of public life.
In the 18th century, that was not unusual.
Now, here's the deal, and it's a great conversation to have, because I can go on and on about it's legitimate, it's Supreme Court supports it, and I can go through that. And again, I'm not advocating that's the right thing, but I'm just giving out the history. And you can still say, so what, Mortman? I still don't like it. I still think it's icky. I will tell you that's a valid response, and I still get people out do presentations on the book, and the last question I get is, I still don't like it. I still don't like praying. totally fine, understandable. To take it out of the courts, to take it out of the legalistic, the big philosophical picture is by having so many religions, including Judaism, represented in prayer, it exhibits America has a breadth and diversity of religions. It's a way of displaying how many different denominations we have.
Our country has a lot of problems right now. The fact that there's a prayer at the start of the congressional day is probably way down the list of things we need to argue about. As you said, you're here to just tell what the history is, not to dip your toes into that thorny debate.
And I will say this, that going into this project, I still don't really have an opinion, but the only opinion I'll say is, and again, I totally get people who say, I can't believe they waste time on this. Why are they praying? There's no place for religion and politics and government. Totally legit to have that reaction.
Takes a few minutes?
Yeah, but if you were to say that and then dismiss the history behind it, and then dismiss, in my case, over 400 rabbis who have prayed, I think the history is amazing and it's fascinating, and the biographies and everything that wrapped up into the color of the people who are praying.
Absolutely.
Then you've missed out on a great sliver of American history.
That's what my podcast is all about. So before we get to the first rabbi, which was 1860, our country starts in the late 18th century, so it took a while to get a rabbi up there. Let's talk a little bit about the tradition of religious tolerance of Jews going back to the very beginning of our republic. Individual states or provinces had established Protestant churches. The Jewish population in the colonies was probably pretty small. But there was a trip by George Washington to Newport. He established a precedent of religious tolerance of Jews at the Toro Synagogue, where I have visited. I used to live in Rhode Island many, many years ago. It's a beautiful place. What are your thoughts on the importance of that moment when Washington wrote that letter to the Jews of Newport saying, we will tolerate you in our new republic?
That letter, and I'm so glad you mentioned that letter is still, to the extent there is a sacred document in the American Jewish community, not at the Torah level, but still an important, that's the center of it. I mean, that letter that he wrote is still cited, and it was very much recognized.
Among American Jews.
Among American Jews, and cited as well in a non-Jewish setting to talk about our country, that we need to be free of religious bigotry and we need to be tolerant of others. But the fact that it goes back to the very beginning, that's so important for the American Jewish experience.
Have you been to the Toro Synagogue?
I've not. I rely on you to share with me the
It's a beautiful place.
Yeah.
It's been a while, but it is beautiful. Okay, so 1860, for the first time ever, a rabbi delivers the opening prayer or blessing. His name was Morris. How do you pronounce this?
Rafael.
Rafael.
Yeah.
Tell us who Morris Rafael was and how did he wind up there?
So 1860, and who was president in February 2nd, 1860?
I know the answer, but if anyone ever says, well, Abe Lincoln, you know that they haven't studied. It was James Buchanan.
James Buchanan was president, but the Civil War was in the air. Now, 10 years earlier was the first time there was a guest chaplain in Congress. The first rabbi, 1860, Morris Rafael, born in Sweden, emigrated here from a congregation, B'nai Jeshurun, which is in New York City, one of the largest, most historic congregations. He almost was not the first one by a quirk of history. The Washington Hebrew congregation, which is still in business here in D.C., had someone else in mind for that first honor. Through their connections, they were putting forward a Rabbi Landsberg, I think was his name. But one problem with Rabbi Landsberg, he spoke fluent German, didn't speak fluent English, so he didn't get the gig. The gig instead went to Morris Rafael, who was at the time a celebrity rabbi who went through the United States and spoke kind of, think of somebody who now would be on TV a lot. He was kind of that level.
Interesting. Kind of an itinerant preacher.
Now, here's the shocking part of Rabbi Morris Rafael. And I will preface this by saying that there are Morris Rafael scholars, and I'm not one, but there are books been written about him. He was pro-slavery.
Wow.
Yeah, so he when he went through the country talking about different subjects, it was pro-slavery. Now, he wrapped it up, I'm going to get a little biblical here, he wrapped it up in the Bible by saying, one of the greatest deeds you can do is free slaves. But in order to free a slave, you have to have slaves.
What?
So, yeah.
First of all, you just said pro-slavery. First of all, if he's familiar with the Old Testament and the stories of the Jews escaping slavery in Egypt, and he's pro-slavery?
Yeah.
Man.
For biblical reasons, because it has to do with the Jubilee year, and you free them in the 49th year.
So he's in D.C.?
I don't actually know why. why he was around that day.
Let me ask you this, though. What, after all these years of never having a rabbi, and you mentioned that there was a practice of having guest chaplains occasionally, what compelled Congress, whoever it was in Congress, to seek out a Jewish prayer?
That's such a great question. I don't know. Let me give a stab at a real answer for that. You'll be shocked to know who sponsored Rabbi Morris Rafael, and this might go back to...
I do not know.
And it's not in the book, so it's okay not to know this. Shyler Colfax.
Oh, yeah.
Now, here's what I want you to answer. Who is Shyler Colfax?
I'm probably going to get this wrong. He either had been a vice president, or he was going to be a vice president.
He was going to be. At the time, he was the Republican leader from Indiana. And he ended up being Ulysses Grant's vice president. It turned out he sponsored Morris Rafael. Now, here's the deal. Shyler Colfax was one of the leading advocates of the passage of the 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves. So here's a congressman who advocated free the slaves, sponsoring a rabbi who
is pro-slavery. Maybe he didn't know.
Maybe didn't know. They didn't Google him back then. Yeah. So I mean, it's one of these twisted. And as a lover of history, it's like cool to talk about it and know that. But
so Rafael, and as you mentioned, born in Sweden, went to New York. So he gives the prayer. What did he have to say? Apparently he went on for longer than he should have.
Thanks to the online searchable congressional record now, you can see it flat out there. It's a long prayer. I mean, it goes on and on. It's like one of your classic 19th century endless oratories. But the things of substance he talks about brethren sitting together. And that's important because, again, we talked about the eve of the Civil War. Again, you can sense the history looming over him being there. It's not entirely about we need to come together, but there's enough messaging in there. If you fast forward, scroll through all the old 19th century kind of rhetoric in there.
So he wasn't that subtle about it. It was obvious to everybody that...
Yeah.
So he went on for a long time, and it sounds like he wasn't necessarily a sensation, but his appearance was noteworthy. It showed up in newspapers. People were looking at him strangely because of his dress.
Exactly right. It made the front page of the New York Times. The strangeness of a Jew, someone described wearing his canonicals up there. The congressmen tittering to each other about, look at that, look at that. It was a shock to the system. It was a shock to the members of Congress. And, I don't want to put 21st century values on 19th century, but you can almost imagine the kind of weird comments that were being said about, for the first time, a rabbi. And it did make news. It made national news, national meeting, front page of the New York Times.
Did what he had to say go over well? I mean, was the prayer appreciated, even though it was more of a sermon?
Yeah, I think the prayer was appreciated. He wasn't ever called back, but they didn't stop inviting rabbis. He was the first, but there would be more to follow. So I'm sure the prayer was appreciated.
So that's 1860. I should ask you, how many rabbis have?
So if you total up from the first one, Rabbi Morris Rafael, a total of about 434 rabbis have prayed in Congress from 1860 to present day, roughly. And so about 434 different rabbis praying on about 630 different occasions. Now, the numbers are different because some rabbis have given 2 or more prayers.
They were invited back.
They were invited back. Like Carson waved them over to the couch and said, "You can come back." Yeah.
So from your book, you write, "Skull caps don't shock us anymore. In the modern TV era, 218 rabbi prayers in Congress have been seen on video. Of those, male and female rabbis, 83% of the time they wore a yarmulke." I mean, your level of detail in your research, I mean, you really must have loved this project. A prayer shawl, only one time. And I want to ask you one more question about Morris Rafael. His appearance was so important that the centenary was marked in the House in 1960, right?
A Rabbi Israel Goldstein came in and gave a prayer in honor of that 100th anniversary, and members of Congress lined up to give tribute to Congressman Roman Paczynski, and a couple others lined up to give tribute to the 100th anniversary of that prayer. And it was actually broadcast on Radio Free Europe and Voice of America, Rabbi Goldstein's 100th year tribute to Rabbi Rafael. So it was a big deal, the 100th anniversary of that event.
So you mentioned a few other really notable guest chaplains. I guess there's never been a full-time rabbi chaplain.
I love that question because every so often they do pick an official chaplain. The current chaplain of the House, her name is Margaret Gruen-Kibben. For the first time, there is a female official chaplain of the House, and that's her. She's a Presbyterian, retired from the Navy. On the Senate side, the official chaplain is Barry Black, and Dr. Barry Black, Seventh-day Adventist, also from the Navy, African-American. So now you have a woman and an African-American official chaplains for the first time, that level of diversity. When those spots open up, and it's not that often, but there is competition. There are people who really want that gig.
Well, it sounds like a nice job.
It sounds like a great job. And I know rabbis through this project.
I mean, if your living is to pray.
Exactly. If your living is to pray, what better gig is there? Yeah. And through the project, I know of rabbis who have angled and applied and just like got the word out that they want to be selected or at least considered for the position. So it is a high honor to be that.
Because the individual faith of the chaplain isn't as important. The prayers they're giving can be heard as I'm not sure the right word.
So good. That's a very important point. It's multi-denominational.
Okay,
it's,
yeah.
The official chaplains, they open each session in prayer. They also minister personally to members of Congress, preside over funerals, a number of different things they do throughout the day that could apply to different religions. So, you don't have a Catholic official chaplain saying, I only do Catholic funerals.
So as you mentioned, there have been hundreds of rabbis. Your book is not 10,000 pages long, so you had to be selective as to who you really wanted to focus on. Your book is an accessible 300 pages or so. One of the rabbis you mentioned is David Phillipson, who was an opponent of Zionism.
This is why you, as a history lover, this is where it gets really good. This is the juicy part. Phillipson, a Reform rabbi, and for the listeners, a Reform Jew. And I have to be very careful about this because I will anger my fellow Reformed Jews, but probably not the level of observance that you would recognize for like an Orthodox Jew.
Well, probably like a Catholic who only goes to church a few times a year.
Roughly, just in really rough terms, exactly. Yeah. Rabbi Phillipson was a Reform leader of the Reform movement, and at the time, this was in the early 1900s, many of these Reformed Jews were non-Zionist or anti-Zionist, and it was for good reason. They believed that America was the place for Jews to come, that Jews escaping the horrors, again, this is before the Holocaust, but the horrors of Russia,
the pogroms. We're talking about the early 20th century here when Phillipson, what's the exact year actually?
I think it was 1904.
Yeah, so early 1900s.
Yeah. So part of the movement that said America's the place to be. So it's like for good reasons, but very much an anti-Zionist. And there were other anti-Zionist rabbis who gave the prayer, but he was one of the leaders of them. He eventually, and they all switched over after the Holocaust and the establishment of Israel. They basically said we were wrong. They do the mea culpa, and they said we're Zionists now. We still love America, but there's got to be a place for Jews to call their homeland.
What did Phillipson talk about in his prayer?
The New Canaan. Now,
referring to the United States.
Referring to the United States, which is really interesting kind of language to use, because Canaan is kind of, that's where you're headed toward in the old days. In the Torah, the Jews are headed toward Canaan, fleeing the Egyptians. So for him, America's the Canaan. And it's really interesting, very theologically based. Patriotism for America, anti-Zionism, just a lot of different concepts.
I wonder if the people who heard his prayers picked up on that.
That's a really good question.
Hard to know, right?
And adopted that saying, like, I'm anti-Zionist because this rabbi is anti-Zionist. I don't doubt that for a second that it probably happened.
Do we know why he was chosen to give the prayer that day? Or?
Many of these rabbis at this stage are big names, like leaders of the Jewish community, probably being chosen at this point because they're famous.
At this time in American history, as you mentioned, there were a large number of Jewish immigrants coming to the United States. I think you said something about the number of Yiddish language newspapers in the country at the time. Arthur Schneier is another famous rabbi who gave a prayer before Congress. Why did he make the cut here?
So Rabbi Arthur Schneier, his first prayer was 1956, I believe, a survivor of the Holocaust. Now, this is really interesting, he is still around and he's still the rabbi at a big New York synagogue. He's given multiple prayers. I believe he's prayed 7 times, most recently about 10 or 15 years ago, but a survivor of the Holocaust. And not only done the prayer in Congress, but he has officiated at other big events. He was in Yankee Stadium after 9/11 and was a rabbi participating in the post-9/11 ecumenical service but he's been giving prayers since the 1950s.
One of the most interesting aspects of your research is how you link these people to the times in which they lived and how those times influenced their thoughts and what they said before Congress, but they always had to kind of walk that fine line of not being too political in what they were saying.
So,
because again, they're brought to pray, not to make a political.
So at this point, let's talk about the rules. Guest chaplains are given rules. They are told, don't be political. Now there are rules saying you can't speak a foreign language in your prayer.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And this is interesting because in my presentations I've done for synagogues, I play videos of rabbis speaking Hebrew. And you can't do that anymore.
Well, I mean, no one's I shouldn't say no one. Most people won't understand what's being said.
Right. Well, that could be part of it too, yeah. So that's part of the rules. But the big one is, as you mentioned, you can't be political in there.
How many times does that get broken? I mean, you watch this every day, right? So do people break that rule?
You know what's funny? When they come close, it's kind of loftier language. Like, for an example, when a guest chaplain, not necessarily a rabbi, but when a guest chaplain says, we are a nation of immigrants, or we need to provide refuge for the ingathering, at a time roughly when there's a vote on an immigration reform bill, for instance, the language kind of matches what's happening, but it still gets through and it's allowed.
So these prayers have to be approved ahead of time?
They do. They have to be submitted to the official chaplains. There is some editing done. I've people tell me, sent back, and you can't say this, you can't say that.
What if you go ahead and say it anyway?
Well, then
that'll be the last time.
That'll be the last time this.
Well, but given the history here, what happened during the Second World War, it's understandable that a rabbi would talk about accepting refugees.
Right, exactly. I mean, many of these rabbis are immigrants, and they've survived the Holocaust and came to America, became rabbis, and prayed in Congress. So the Jewish story is wrapped up in immigration. To make this bigger, the official chaplain, Barry Black, was famously, during one of the budget crises about 10 years ago, did a series of prayers about how we have to behave. The members of the Senate have to behave and pass the budget. And he mentioned budget in his prayers. That was probably the most overt mention of, he was like, pushing them to agree on something.
Well, everything is political now, so I wonder how many times chaplains in the recent years use their better judgment to avoid wading into our thorny politics. Well, you mentioned a couple of examples here. Samuel Saskin, who was praying in the House in March of 1951, so early Cold War. He said, "Pioneers and workers with spirits seared by tyranny have come here for refuge and safety. In gratitude for that refuge, they have cemented even more strongly the free institutions of our beloved nation." You also quote Israel Polyev. That was in 1994. For more than 2 centuries, our blessed and beloved country has been the haven for those fleeing tyranny and oppression. So they're making it pretty clear how they feel. In some ways.
Yeah, in some way, totally.
That's not really a prayer. That's more of a statement.
It's clear what they're saying. It comes from the Jewish experience. It comes from the heart. But it's not a prayer. It's a statement about what America is. So much of this you cannot separate from the American Jewish experience. You can't separate the Statue of Liberty and Emma Lazarus and the poem, the New Colossus.
You cite Representative Eugene Keogh, a Democrat from New York, who said, "Our guest chaplain today is a distinguished Brooklynite, and the following release issued by him is quite interesting. A refugee from Dachau had his dream come true today when he stood before the opening of the House, delivering his invocation as a clergyman of the Jewish faith." He was referring to Polyev.
Yeah, so
who gave that stirring statement about the importance of refugees and liberty.
So he mentioned Dachau in that, and thank you for bringing that up. Dachau, one of the concentration camps. I think about 6 of the rabbis who have prayed in Congress are also Auschwitz survivors.
Wow.
And you're totally right to say, wow, when you think about it, it's stunning that they survived Hitler and the Germans, and they came to America, became rabbis, and then ended up praying in the very literal center of democracy.
Who's going to edit the prayer of somebody who's been through there? Not me. They've earned the right to say whatever they want.
Exactly, right.
So this was a labor of love, but it must have been a difficult book to write insofar. Who's looking for these records? You might have been the only one.
So here's the really fun part, and I'm not
You're not a professional historian.
I'm not a professional historian. I'm not a professional Jew. I'm just the really cool thing at the core of this. The cool thing is creating a lane of history, creating an alley of history that no one's ever thought could be history. No one ever thought about rabbis praying in Congress even happening, let alone a book being written about it. Just to create history where none existed is a thrill, is really cool. Now, a couple challenges to that. First, because no one's done this before, I have to get it right. Like, this is where, like, triple checking and making sure it's all there, it's all correct.
And most of your sources were primary sources, right? There's not too many books that you could have consulted.
Right, exactly. So two things. There's no precedent for this, so you can't fact check it against something else, which is fine. That's both thrilling and daunting and frightening at the same time. But this is so important. Thank you for saying the primary sources. You can extrapolate this lesson to anything. You can go through the congressional record and create a story where nothing existed before, or through the C-SPAN video, the archives. And the story that I created is a story of rabbis praying in Congress. But you can look at what they said about Washington, D.C., and write about, you could talk about sports mentioned in Congress. I mean, there's an unlimited number of topics that is laying there for these stories to be told. I did this as a quirk. You know, you ran the numbers about how many wore yarmulkes, had coverings. So it's kind of like the sabermatics of rabbis praying in Congress. You know,
well,
metrics.
That's the proof that you watched every single available
right.
video if you're counting the yarmulkes.
It's on a Google spreadsheet I have at home of every rabbi, what they said, what they wore, who sponsored them, party, sex, gender, what they said, and all that. So, no, it really gets into the numbers and the metrics of this.
So you made this decision to write the book. I'm assuming before you had a publisher, right? I mean, who wanted this book, right?
Yeah, who wanted it? I did everything wrong. Everybody who's written a book says you write your table of contents, you write a sample chapter, you get a book agent. Now, it occurred to me I could not explain this concept by doing a sample chapter. I had to write the whole thing. And then it occurred to me, as I sent out 100 cold letters to book agents and being laughed at 100 different times, that not only am I going to have to sell this book idea to an agent, then we have to sell it to a publisher. I skipped the agent because it was just a waste of time, then sent out 100 pitch letters to book publishers. I came across the one publisher who said, I get it, I understand what you're doing. And the publisher is Academic Studies Press, who specializes in two types of books, Jewish history and Slavic history.
You found the right.
I found the right one. I'm not the Slavic expert, but I found it. So they've been great. They took a chance on this, and I'm to the point now where my eyes tear up thinking about how many stories and books people should be writing, and stories out there who aren't part of the club, who aren't part of the world of, the next book's out and here are the pre-sales and all that. But there are a lot of struggling authors there who have great stories about American history to tell and just need the opportunity to do so.
Well, the book's a page turner, and these stories are really colorful, but at the same time they're sobering when you think of the contexts of all these prayers and who these rabbis were. Many of them had stirring and important personal backgrounds, if not totally quirky, like the first rabbi who somehow supported slavery.
Right.
I wonder what his parents thought of that.
Yeah, and again, I appreciate all that. And again, it's about rabbis. It's written from a Jewish angle, but it's really for people who are just enthusiasts for congressional history, who just want to learn about something about what the Congress does. They had no idea that goes on.
Well, I get tired of being angry at Congress, so it's nice to read something that's on the other side of that equation. On the next episode of History as It Happens, when support for voting rights transcended party.
Really, it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
60 years after LBJ broke a filibuster to win bipartisan approval for the landmark Voting Rights Act, the major parties are entirely split on today's voting legislation. We'll chart the reasons why next when we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.